Good evening, Instagram. It's been several months since my last live. I think during the more strict period of lockdown, the Instagram live space become very crowded. There was a lot going on, but In Conversation with is back. I've got some really exciting guests lined up for the next couple of months, starting with tonight, joined by William Kelley, wine writer, critic, at the Wine Advocate, covering mostly Champagne and Burgundy. But I think first and foremost, he's a passionate wine lover as well. And I think that's probably how he would like to be introduced. I think we have William already with us, so we'll send him a request. We'll get him in and give people a second to join. Evening, William, or afternoon.
Hey, good evening. Good evening. I'm just trying to organize this the camera a little bit. There you go. Hi. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. My pleasure. What time is it there?
Oh, it's 1 p.m., so good time for a glass of Aigle Urier.
Yeah, so I am Ulis Colon. So it's 7 here though, so a little bit more reasonable, I think.
Well, I'm working, so.
I suppose that's the plus side of being a quote unquote wine professional. It's
Absolutely.
It's always work.
So that's what people imagine it's like, I think. Yeah.
or dream and aspire.
Right.
So, William, obviously, I want to touch on Champagne and Burgundy, maybe sort of a little later in the discussion, or maybe part 2. But I think I'd sort of like to start with maybe some playfully provocative topics, but more sort of talking about wine writing, what wine writing is to you, and sort of wine criticism today. So I think before that, though, it'd probably be nice to just give people a little idea of, who is William Kelley? Where did wine kind of enter, your life? And I suppose when did you realise that wine was going to be the profession?
Sure. Well, I would describe myself as an accidental wine writer in a sense, but certainly not an accidental wine lover. I got interested in wine when I was 17, 18. A family friend opened an old bottle of Bordeaux with me, 1955 Linge. And my parents, buy wine and drink wine, but not sort of wines I wrote about. They don't keep wine from one week to the next, particularly. So this was a window into something different.
You don't share the spend with them. Then you don't let them know what.
No.
You don't let them know what has amassed.
But they like it. It's like, oh, this is pretty good. Okay. Yeah, it should be. Chateau But. I became very interested in wine just that first sort of taste of 55 Linge. In fact, it was, which is, a very nice Linge, not particularly profound vintage, but just incredibly complex and serious. And this was back in 2007, 2008. So I immediately started reading everything I could about wine. Went to university, joined a tasting group that I ended up running for 4 years. We had every week top producers coming. We had producers from Burgundy, Bordeaux, California, Rome. Big producers like First Growth Chateau and big champagne houses, but also tiny ones like Yves Gangloff in Condrieu has 3 hectares at best, and so on. So I got gradually more and more into it. I think everybody realized sooner than me that I was going to make a career out of it, because I was intending to write books, stay in academia, in academic history. I did a doctorate in history. And, I like to say that further education is the only form of institutionalized punishment where you get extra time for good behavior. So I just, at Oxford for eight years, studying, writing books, writing this thesis. And at the end, I sort of haphazardly said to somebody I was interested in making wine one day. One of the producers had come to visit us. He said, come work harvest in California. So, so I did. And about the same time, I started writing for Decanter through a sort of chance, but felicitous encounter. It went very well. It escalated quickly, and a few years later, I got the wine advocate job. So now I live in Burgundy for half the year, working on full time, getting a visa at the end of this year to stay in Burgundy full time. Tasted around 4,500, 5,000 wines a year, 25,000, 30,000 kilometers on the French road network, visiting hundreds of producers, and it's and I make a bit of wine also. that first ambition to make wine, which was really what made me go to California, wasn't to write about it, but to make it. That has to some extent come to fruition with a bit of my own Chenin Blanc in California and a bit of Burgundy since 2018. So,
Yeah, and I think probably something important, which is something you've said to me personally, is that, and I think it sort of carries through to your approach to wine now, is that you had a desire to kind of pursue like a first order career, something that was producing a product where your academic study had been, we can definitely call that in the realm of the intellectual, but you wanted to produce a product, so to speak.
Right, and I think by the time if you get into writing a doctoral thesis in the humanities, so much of it is commenting on commentators. It's not even a second order activity; it's a third order activity, and you're very removed from anything real, anything creative. And that was definitely something I craved, and something that wine has brought to me, because it's immensely intellectually stimulating too. I mean, I remember one of my friends at Oxford saying, "How can you go and make wine? Because it's just a menial task. Aren't you going to get bored?" I thought, well, I haven't gotten bored yet. That's for
yeah,
sure.
there was an irony to hearing somebody say that, for sure. So I suppose now you kind of hold a relatively important position at one of the biggest wine publications today, and Burgundy and Champagne are arguably two of the most desired regions in the world, even with the. Yeah, I was going to say, even with the rise of the New World, I think there's no slowdown in the excitement for
right. And I mean, I think that the dominant concepts in the wine world today, for better or worse, because there's some problems with it, but this is the concept of terroir. And if everything is premised on terroir, if sense of place is what we esteem and aspire to the most in wine, then obviously Burgundy is going to remain, the pole star of our wine culture. And I mean, I think it's not just a question of dominating the auction markets and being incredibly expensive, sought after wines, but Burgundy defines the sort of way wine in general is perceived from a sort of philosophical, intellectual perspective. I think that's part of its strength. That's why it's going to be so hard, even if the wines are becoming harder and harder to access. It's one of the reasons why Burgundy, I think, is going to remain sort of culturally dominant in our wine culture for a while longer.
Yeah, I think it's almost become an adjective, right? Burgundy in wine, because we talk about Pinot Noir around the world, and we automatically compare it to Burgundy, and the same for Chardonnay. But I think I've sort of got some notes down that'll touch on some of your ideas around terroir a bit later. But I suppose the first question I think is interesting to touch on is, what makes a great wine writer? What is the what's the recipe?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I think about quite often from the perspective of trying to improve, because, one should be trying to improve all the time. It's funny, there are a lot of different aspects to it. One, I think, that is underestimated and not talked about enough is the simple physical capacity to withstand constant assault, barrage of alcohol. So, if you have a day where you do 6 or 7 tastings, you have to be fresh at the end of the day. There's a physical resilience. It's essentially, look at someone like Robert Parker, who used to taste about 10,000 wines a year, which is pretty much double what I do, and that requires an amazing constitution. So that's something that's underrated. And you see, some people who sometimes who may be very thoughtful, intelligent, insightful, good tasters, but can't taste more than 15 wines in a day, and there's no shame in that, but it does make it very difficult to be productive and to cover any sort of breadth as well as the depth, which is the interesting complement to breadth of coverage.
And I think sometimes sometimes you actually see that. I think if you read notes, they become over time you can almost tell who's writing them from the descriptors that are used, because it almost feels like that tasting process has gone on so long that they've become tired through the tasting, and actually
the notes get fluffy.
They either become fluffy or they become one of the same.
And I've had that experience myself. I mean, there were days, especially when I was covering California Central Coast, Washington, even in the Beaujolais, when I've done over 100 wines in a day. And I resolved never to do it again, because it's I could tell the last 15, 20 tasting notes are not remotely close to the quality of the first 15, and that's not fair to the producers nor to our readers. It's not the sort of quality of work that I want to be doing. Another really important thing that I think is not talked about enough is that for me, a wine writer has to have some sort of animating purpose behind their work, beyond simply trying to review all the wines that are in the market. And then that also creates opportunity for people to disagree with that animating purpose and to, for that writer to become controversial. And you can think of examples where that's occurred. But it's essential for there to be some sort of coherence to the body of work, and for there to really be a sort of passion and interest behind it. And it can be various sorts of things. It could even be wanting to sort of puncture the pomposity of the wine world, or be an advocate for the consumer, or whatever. But for me, beyond obviously wanting to serve our subscribers and readers, absolutely that's a priority. But I think if on the one hand I can write more about the viticultural agronomic basis of wine production and to try to valorize that, foreground the importance of that, and if on the other I can, because I'm dealing with regions that are very hierarchical. None more so than Burgundy, with the appellation system, and within that producer reputations, village reputations. If I can to some extent break down some of the glass ceilings that are imposed upon producers in lesser, so-called lesser appellations, lesser regions, but who are putting in the work, whether in the vineyards and the cellar. If I can level the playing field for those producers a little bit, because I sometimes feel that, in the Côte Chalonnaise, you have a much lower chance of getting a high score than you do if you're, working with third leaf vines in a totally never before planted vineyards in California, So I would like to give those guys a chance, and, hopefully when I'm done, or at least, I don't know how long that'll be, but when I feel that I've achieved that, it would be very gratifying if, people feel that if they put in the work, they're going to get recognition, which hasn't always been the case, frankly,
and I think
in my regions.
Yeah, that sort of animating vision has to also, I think, not be something that is just simply expedient, something that's the quirk of the time. I think a lot of what I see emerging now is kind of, want to sort of champion affordable wines or make wine accessible. And I think these are kind of proximate visions, so to speak. They don't really get to the root of, like you just said, they don't really get to the root of what is your particular vision and how are you going to kind of achieve that. But
for me it came out of, it's not an a priori vision that I went into wine writing wanting to execute. It's something that I extrapolated from tasting the wines that moved me the most. And you go and you taste like this Aiguillerie d'Espon Provencher that I'm drinking. This had 84. This is just non-vintage cuvée. Had 84 months sur lab. Francis Aiguille has over his career built up something like 8 years production equivalent in stock that he hasn't sold. And yet you will sometimes see people saying, "Oh, well, the Gros champagnes can never be as good as the Grand Marque non-vintage because they don't have the art of blending," or things like that. And you say, "Well, Aiguille's vineyards are much better farmed than the vast majority of Grand Marque. Very few Grand Marque do 84 months or that." So I completely reject those sort of artificial glass ceilings that are imposed on wines like that. But it's the taste of the wine and the glass that shows you that there's something to think about there. And it's the same whether it's, Doray Gential in Rouilly, or if it's somebody making great stuff in Beaujolais or whatever. You start with the wine and then you think, well, okay, there's something wrong with our wine culture if we're marking down these wines because they don't have the name of a famous house or a famous appellation on the label.
And would it be fair to say that the idea of the kind of animated vision is something that you look for in a wine as well? Because I think people who have read your writings, I think, will know that you kind of gravitate towards wines that have more of a signature and more of, they are wines that also, whilst not taking away the fact that they are from a particular place, they also have this winemaker behind them who has themselves an animated vision.
Absolutely. The analogy I like to make is that winemaking is like a jigsaw puzzle, and if you're going to assemble it, all the many myriad decisions being the different pieces of the puzzle, if you're going to assemble it, you better have seen the picture on the box, So you can't take pieces from one person's puzzle and say, "Oh, well, I like that guy's élevage, I'm going to copy that element of it," and expect it to be some sort of coherent aesthetic vision. And the great producers for me are ones who have these very coherent visions for what they want to, aesthetic visions for what they want to achieve, whereby every element, every decision is directed towards making something persuasive, something characterful, and you know, that creates sometimes wines that people don't like. I mean, a great example would be Solos, and I can certainly see why there are people who just hate those wines, or even, you know, there are some wines that are very stylized that everybody seems to love that I don't really understand. I mean, I think wines like Ganava or even Coche de Riz that have very strong style. It sometimes surprises me that more people don't admit to not liking them in a way. I mean, if I were reduced to making very characterful wines, I would almost hope to make wines that some people don't like, because
it goes back to exactly what you just said about writing, right? When you put out that animated vision, there's the chance that people aren't going to side with that vision or that style, and that's almost part of the excitement of. That's part of the excitement of having an animated vision in whether it be writing or wine.
Right. And I think there's a problem that one of the many problems with contemporary wine writing is that it's too collegiate. You know, nobody disagrees, and I think that's healthy. I mean, it's perfectly acceptable for you know, say Essie Haviland, who commentates on champagne, to like 2010 Dom Perignon a lot more than me. That's fine. You know, and we can both have our reasons and arguments, and then people can see who thinks what, and that's very healthy. I mean, you know, some sort of a healthy wine discourse needs to make more space for debate and disagreement and a plurality of tastes, because, you know, I mean, I sometimes think about this when I review champagne. I confess, you know, I like concentrated vinous champagnes. I'm a Burgundy lover, and if the more champagne has in common with a great wine from Burgundy, the more I'm likely to like it. That's not everybody will share that. You know, some people would like sort of very ethereal, chalky, pillowy sort of styles of Blanc to Blanc. It can be very, you know, and I try to do justice with those sorts of wines when I review them. I just don't happen to have very many in my cellar, and I worry sometimes that I'm imposing my own taste to an excessive degree on our reviews. I mean, that's the pressure of working at the Wine Advocate, is in the sense, obviously, you have to have this animating vision and a strong view, I think, to be followed. If people take an interest, people know where you're coming from. But equally, the Wine Advocate is, in a sense, a bit like the wine world's answer to Standard and Poor's, you know. And if I write off an entire style of wine just because it doesn't, you know, hugely titillate me, then, you know, well, it's just not very fair, you know. So one tries to be fair and as useful as possible to the reader who pay the bills, you know. So that's the real priority, of course.
You touched briefly there on the sort of collegiate nature of wine writing. Now, I think something I was thinking about before this chat was wine writing can feel a little stagnant at times. You know, much of the same from all angles. And I think I've seen Laura commenting here, who I know has said this to me before. There seems to be a very strict model in the wine industry when it comes to working in the wine industry. You've obviously booked that trend, but it seems to be WSET 1, 2, 3 diploma, MW for the kind of chosen few. To what level do you think kind of this model may contribute to that sort of stagnation and collegiate nature? Does it create, you know,
I think that's especially true of the UK wine writing, perhaps. You know, in the US, I think there's an element where, I mean, quite a lot of the people writing about wine are people who either work for or at one point worked for the Wine Advocate. So that's sort of the other part. That's pretty much the two parts. The one is WSET, and then there are blogs and things and whatnot. But no, I mean, I think, well, there's a component to WSET where you have to learn some technical stuff, but there's also a component whereby you have to sort of learn what are essentially someone else's opinions about wine, which, you know, obviously is going to be homogenizing if you having a discussion where, based on perception, now not based on pH, but you have to define a wine as medium plus or medium minus acidity. Yeah, we can talk about pH and TA and all sorts of things, and that's fine. But if you're doing it on perception, well, our perceptions vary, and I think.
Yeah, I remember
I went to marked wrong for saying it's medium plus when it's supposed to be medium minus. That's.
Yeah, I remember I went on a trip. Happenstance brought about a trip to the Mosul in 2019 with a group of WSET diploma students, and the question in the cellar was constantly around pH and TA. And I remember one of the winemakers kind of saying, sort of, you know, why do you care? What do you think about the wine? What's your take on, you know, what I'm trying to do in the cellar and how they taste?
Yeah. But that's not a question in the exam, right?
Yeah, precisely. And I think that's the point I was sort of getting at with that
Yeah.
question. How much does that, it's not really a production, or it's not really an environment that fuels heuristics. It's kind of an environment that fuels
Learning
more
facts.
regurgitation of
Yeah.
encyclopedia.
No, I mean, I personally would like to see also, I would like to see more amateurs writing about wine, but, the sort of, a lot of the world's greatest wines are completely out of reach financially today. But there are people who buy them and drink them on a regular basis. And I'd like to see more of those people write about wines because, you read someone like George Sainsbury's notes on a cellar book, and okay, the language is a bit arcane. It's a bit hard to read for the early 21st century reader, given the way it's written. But one thing that I always appreciated about that book is his sort of intimacy with great wines and his ability. He never visited the wine regions, never visited the producers, but he knew them very well, the wines, and gave his opinion. And I'd love to see a bit more of that, of people sort of, the ultimate independence is just being able to buy the wines and say what you think. So I'd love to see a bit more of that. I mean, I tried to do a bit of that myself because I buy a lot of wine and I read about older wines that I bought, but I think there's a space for that, because there are two points of view to come at wine. Really, one is the sort of appreciative way, which is like any consumer can taste wine, and we all do taste wine, and we have our own emotional response to it, and it's more or less interesting depending on how clearly it's articulated, the nuance of the perceptions, and so on. The other is to be an actual technical taster and know something about making wine, know something about how to taste wines at different phases of its evolution before it's bottled, things like that. But there's a lot of space for the former, I think. And I make a bit of wine myself. I try to be a good technical taster, but I certainly wouldn't disparage the sort of just appreciative wine tasting. And I don't really think you need a qualification for that.
Yeah, and it becomes, even for, I suppose I would consider myself on the sort of fringe of the industry, not so much in, but definitely not out. And it becomes very, even for us, on the fringes, it becomes very kind of, what do you have to do to get into that industry when you see every single forum, every single, new magazine that emerges, every single article in a magazine is the same people, the same writers. They've all got MW. They're all the same people who you expect. And it kind of gets to the point where we're just consuming the same ideas in the same format. And it becomes very, it doesn't challenge. One doesn't feel challenged to go further.
And what's monetizable is part of it. What's the things that get the most clicks are listicles, so you're going to see a lot of articles about the 10 best rosés, so I promise you, because a lot of people click on it and it generates traffic on the site. And then you're going to see, people always looking for the next sort of thing to talk about, but it's always the same thing and what everyone else is talking about. So at the moment, it's things like the rise of Aligoté. I think some people are still on the rise of Saint-Aubin, even though that happened a while ago now. And, it does become very repetitive. I mean, the slightly offensive, but the analogy I make is with those sort of cookbooks produced by the people who manufactured Spam in the 1950s, sort of 50 different things to use Spam for. But it's still Spam. At the end of the day, it's Spam.
Yeah, and none of the recipes are particularly attractive. Nor do they,
when it comes to tin pineapple and jelly and so on.
So how do you feel that, you mentioned right at the start that you've made some wine and you're making wine in Burgundy now and some Chenin Blanc, and I think you've mentioned some other sort of wines that you'd like to make in the future. But how do you feel like making wine has aided your wine writing, or even helped it evolve to where it is now?
For me, it's been transformative. It's made me a much better taster because, frankly, it's rare that people don't sort of correct you when you make a mistake tasting. Often, I mean, even in the context of formal classes and whatnot.
Sorry to jump in, William. Just as you said there, it's an interesting point that you make, that there are mistakes.
And I don't mean
tasting is solely...
your taste. I don't mean your taste. Your taste is wrong. I mean, sometimes people say, "Oh, they're a good taste." That just means that they like the same wines as I like. Yes. What I mean is, can somebody taste a wine that's reduced, full of suspended lees, and just not showing well, and see that there's something interesting behind that or not? And most people can't. And the best way to learn how to do that is to taste the same wine, especially a wine you made over a course of months, and see how it evolves, and also just follow multiple times. I mean, a lot of wines I taste a couple of times from barrel and from bottle, and then from bottle a few years later, and you can join the dots, but you have to have a very good memory to do that. It's easier if it's a wine in a barrel, it's your own wine, So in that sense, it's a great school for technical tasting. I think it also, I mean, yeah, this is one of the tensions also. I mean, I mentioned being the standard and poor of the wine world, but another tension is obviously the priority is to the subscribers, and that was the sort of raison d'etre of the Wine Advocate from the beginning. But equally, one has to be conscious, and I think respectful at least, of the fact that you can be tasting a wine which represents 3 years' work of somebody's life. And if you catch it on a bad day, or you catch it when you're having a bad day, and you wipe it out in the review, you can see why people don't like it. I mean, I often say when sometimes producers not happy with having not got a high enough score or whatever, especially in this day and age where there's always someone who'll give a higher score than you. Often several, and I say to them, but what would you score it? So let's turn the tables. But I think it's also interesting on my side to produce wine and think, well, how would someone else appraise this, and how would it feel to have this wine appraised by somebody else? So for me, it's been very helpful, both as a school for being a better taster, and I think as a sort of humanizing thing. It keeps me a bit grounded. I hope. I mean, I know surely there are people who think that I'm not at all grounded, but to the extent that I could be considered grounded and avoided getting the sort of big head of the person who just sort of decides what score the wine gets and what price the wine sells for and all of that, which is a danger which one sees, people having fallen into over the years.
Yeah, and I suppose it raises the question when we talk about whether people have I suppose invested that amount of experience or time in trying to craft their perception of wine, of what is it, so to speak, that makes a wine professional? Is it only what we just said? Is it?
The simple answer is that you get paid.
Well, I suppose that's the question, isn't it? Do we consider wine professionals people who follow the model and have a title to put by their name, or is it somebody who makes a living from wine, or is it just simply someone who has something so important or interesting to say that they have a sizable amount of people who are willing to engage with what they have to say? Does that make them a wine professional?
For me, just from a sort of selfish personal definition, I'd say for me the acid test is, can somebody taste a wine either in barrel or very young, and see where it's going. And that's pretty rare. I mean, one thing I've started doing in Burgundy is doing these 40-year-on retrospectives, because I thought, some people do 10 years on, some people occasionally do 20 years on, so let's do 40 years on. And it's, I look back and compare with the French and Anglophone wine reviews of the time, and there were fewer back then, of course, because it was less of a smaller industry. But it's amazing how often people were completely wrong. And it's extremely humbling, along with the fact of making one's own wine. But even reading how often sensible people, good tasters, people who thought about it hard, tried to do a good job, got it completely wrong. And there are whole vintages even that just get sort of forgotten as a result of these early judgments that were mistaken. So it's tough. It's tough. But I think the better you are at that, the more you could be considered professional, because that's a skill that is not just the skill that anyone who opens a bottle of wine can develop. And that the latter, incidentally, is one of the nice things about wine, is there is no real, there's no qualification required to open a great bottle of wine at home. That's not something that doesn't require technical training, and thankfully not.
Yeah, for sure. And I suppose it goes back to as well recognising, being able to exercise restraint as a wine taster and a wine critic, because if you don't recognise that day can be an off day, and that experience can be an off day, and all of a sudden we write off this vintage or write off that vintage, it all of a sudden becomes, sort of embedded in one's mind that that's a vintage to put to bed and nothing of any interest, or even a producer,
Yeah, and I mean, I did dinner with some friends the other night, and I opened blind off vintage Bordeaux, and everybody thought the 81s were 82s or 85s, and everybody thought the 94s were 95s. Everybody thought the 2002s were like 2004s or 2001s or whatever. No, I mean, nobody guessed the vintages. And does that mean that the wines are better than anyone could have anticipated? Or does it mean that people got the early judgment of those vintages wrong? I'd say to an extent, people just got them wrong. 81 Bordeaux is very nice vintage, still very nice today. And now I think it's the sort of wines where people open them and they taste them and it's, this is great. Oh, but we have to deduct 3 points because it's not from a good vintage. It can't really be that good. And this is the sort of thing you have to try to fight against in wine rating. In 2017, Red Burgundy almost fell into that trap because the wines were a little fluid, a little easy, open, even a little dilute, they seemed in barrel. And bottle, they're fantastic. But I think there's still a tendency by people to sort of say, but it's just 17. I mean, I underestimated those wines, but I'm very happy to come back and revise my opinion. In wine, there can only be provisional conclusions,
And I expect, do you find that a learning curve for you as well, to look back at that
hugely.
vintage and look at what you got wrong in the tasting process and how that changes for you in the future?
Absolutely. No, and it's essential. You have to be constantly revisiting wines and be open to saying, no, we underestimated it. And there's no shame in that. I certainly feel that I have not diminished my standing by saying I like 17s better from bottle than barrel. That's not, I don't, maybe some readers think that, I don't know. I certainly have no complaints.
Just before we go on, I've seen a couple of people asking questions. If you do have a question to ask, drop them in the question box. I think it's at the bottom of the screen, and then towards the end of the conversation, we can pick them back up properly and sort of give them the attention that they deserve, as opposed to dropping them in. So I suppose this kind of cuts through a couple of the things that we've just been saying in terms of talking about the industry very much turning to the same voices, the model of entering the industry. I wanted to ask you, or actually not even ask you, because I think I know your opinion, but I wanted to talk about Instagram influencers, which I think is a great topic to touch on in terms of, personally for me, I think Instagram represents a really good opportunity to break the mold of much of the same.
Absolutely.
And what I find even more interesting is there is a huge pushback in the industry. There's tons of articles about how so much fraud exists in Instagram, and it, I wondered, you've done quite a good job of embracing the Instagram videos and embracing Instagram as a platform to communicate with people who maybe can't get to Burgundy. What are your thoughts on that element of the wine industry at the moment?
No, but you're right. There is a sort of animosity towards people commenting on wine on Instagram. And it's funny, the last time I did an interview, there were a lot of sort of leading questions of like, what do you think about influencers? Are they serious? And they were trying to get a sort of critical response out of me. But no, I mean, I think it's refreshing, and I think it's also natural when most of the sort of, you could say, legacy media wine publication positions are largely dominated by people who've already been doing the job for 30 years. People are going to need new ways to express themselves. No, but it's great. You can show different things. You can show people the topography of a vineyard. My daughter's coming to try to show me a new dress she's bought. Hello, Fran. Yeah, it's very pretty. Yeah, but I'm busy now. Little one, I'll talk to you later. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Yeah.
The joys of fatherhood.
Absolutely, and then they are considerable. But no, I mean, I think you two can talk about the topography of, say you're walking around Le Montrachet. This is an example I sometimes give, and why does the Puligny side have the article Le Montrachet, the Montrachet, and why does Chassagne not? And it implies a preference. And okay, you walk along, and there's the commune boundary, and there's a big dip, and suddenly the exposition of the vineyard changes, which you don't really understand because it's quite minor, even on a topographical map you can't see that. So like a video of that suddenly shows you things that would be very hard and tedious to communicate in writing. Somebody
just said, when is your first TikTok?
Oh yeah. I think I have the hip mobility for TikTok.
And I think what's really interesting about Instagram is there are people who there are people who are perhaps not talking about the same kind of things that you or I would find interesting, but they're certainly doing things or communicating wine in a way that might break down a particular perception of wine, and they do it extremely well. And then compare.
Nothing survives on social media that people don't watch, And if you're doing
I think
video after video and you have 40,000 followers and 200 people are watching them, it's a sign to do something different. So it's free for everybody to watch. I'm a fan. I think the more darts we throw at the board, the more chances we have of hitting something as well. And wine as a whole needs to I think should exploit new media for communicating about wine and where it comes from.
Yeah, and what's interesting as well is some of the Instagram influencers in the wine community have built these absolutely enormous platforms in relativity to the audience that they have is huge. And I think if anything, it would be of great value to some of the people who are most vehement against them to actually perhaps take into account.
It's about niches as well. I mean, I believe that there's a niche for everything, and the sort of content I produce is pretty serious, and I think goes into a lot of technical detail, history, geography, geology, technique, winemaking techniques. And this is true of my writing as well. I have the luxury of writing for a niche that wants it. That happens to be what I want to write about. And I happen to be writing for that niche, so I'm a very happy guy. But there are a lot of different niches in the wine industry, and a lot of people who don't want to talk about those things, who want to talk about other aspects of wine, and I think that's fantastic, I wouldn't want to force anyone to watch my videos or read my content, and vice versa. I think it's and the more diverse wine media can be, the better for everybody.
Yeah, I would agree. I think someone just asked a question on the bottom there. We'll pick up on a little bit later. So you mentioned you said very briefly there, wine kind of needs this approach, or wine could value this approach. You write for The Wine Advocate, arguably, I don't know the exact numbers, but certainly one of the top three, if not the top wine publication in terms of readership, subscribers. What do you think is the future for big publications? Because something I've been very surprised by, the kind of the lack of innovation from the big publications. I have a subscription to Decanter that somebody bought me as a Christmas present about 12 months ago, and I don't even look at the magazine anymore. They just seem to have there's an abject lack of innovation. What do you think the direction is? Do you see there being more small publications?
I mean, and the Wine Advocate is relatively small. I think obviously disproportionately influential in the wine market, but it's a niche. Again, as I was saying, that there are niches, and it's a very robust one. I mean, everybody says subscription media is dead, but the Wine Advocate is doing very well. And I'm sure some of the other subscription sites are doing. If you produce good content, I think the onus is on us to have interesting things to say, to go deeper, to go further. There's the luxury of having a proper expenses budget and a salary, and living in the region that you're working on. I think the onus on us is to say new things and take the conversation forward, not just novel things for the sake of it. To be original for the sake of originality, but let's be in our regions thinking about wine. I wake up in the night thinking about press cycles for making Chardonnay. I mean, I'm obsessed with this stuff, and I hope that comes across when I'm writing. And I've got some more projects in the next 6 months, which hopefully will be interesting to people in that regard.
Yeah, and it raises an interesting point of that. Is there how many people writing about wine for the sort of the much larger publications? How many of them really love wine? And how many of them is it such that, for example, I don't work in wine. I have a job, and I certainly enjoy my job, but I absolutely don't love it. And for how many people who work in wine, is it a job and not a love? And how does that, I think often that comes across in the writing
Yeah.
because
Oh no, it completely comes across, and it goes back to the first question you asked: what makes a great wine writer? I mean, maybe the first thing I should have said is somebody who buys wine, you know, and that is the best way. And that was one of Robert Parker's strengths. One of the best ways to retain an authentic consumer perspective is to purchase wine, and then you know, I bought this bottle of Egli, and if I give it a good review, if I opened it now and was disappointed by it, I would be the first to be frustrated and to want to. You know, it's a corrective. It's an important feedback loop that I think is essential. And it also, you know, obviously, if you're writing about wine, you need to be passionate about wine. And if you're not passionate enough to spend some of your own money on it, then you're not very passionate.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think I've said to you before, I think I'm in a fortunate position now where some of my work has become paid, and there's a sort of, you know, there's a small revenue associated with that, and the absolute entirety of that money is spent on wine.
I mean,
and more.
I wouldn't say I made a living, but when I was working for Decanter, I was paid 25 pence per word, you know. And it was unlike Charles Dickens, did not have an unlimited word count. It shows in his novels, incidentally. You know, but I still bought wine, perhaps irresponsibly. In fact, definitely irresponsibly.
Yeah,
didn't have kids at that stage.
My purchasing is still certainly irresponsible. So.
It's very hard not to be irresponsible with contemporary wine prices. But that's I was talking about the Bordeaux 2020 futures campaign the other day. I said they're very clever. They've anticipated inflation.
how polite. Yeah, how polite of them.
So don't worry, this is what it will be worth in 3 years' time.
Yeah, which almost, you know, it adds to that element of commoditization, right? It just becomes, you know, when you're starting to factor in inflation to wine purchasing, it's and then it's arguable about who is Standards and Poor and who's Moody's and who's playing with the prices. But so I think something you've seen me do on Instagram, I like to kind of throw questions out to followers on Instagram and just see what they comment on posts, and I really like it because it helps me gauge, you know, how accurate are my own thoughts? How, you know, what are other people thinking? And I think the other day,
if I may interject, that's actually one of my favorite aspects of having a sort of minor Instagram presence is that people who read my work in the wine advocate have a way to reach me easily and express their views. Actually, a bit. You know, I don't necessarily always ask direct questions like you do, but people are able to exchange with me. Which otherwise I'd just be sort of publishing numbers out of 100 into a black hole, you know, and I wouldn't have much contact with what people are thinking about. So that's another aspect I really appreciate about this sort of ecosystem.
Yeah. And going back to what you just said, you know, there's an immediate feedback loop, because when I post an interesting question that people want to engage with, you know, the post gets a ton of traction, and I get that immediate feedback loop of, okay, actually people are thinking about this topic and people want to know more. And that feeds into what I then create and generate. But, you know, what I asked followers the other day, sort of about wine critics today. And something that came up was that, I suppose the way I would digest it is that a lot of wine critics do half of the job. They tell us what's great. You know, everything's great, everything's fantastic. The wine I taste is brilliant, and this producer is superb. But nobody's bad, and there seems to be like an abject lack of robust critique. Which for me, a wine critic has an important job to not only inform the reader, but to kind of serve as, you know, something that keeps pushing the region towards, you know, doing better and questioning itself. Do you see that lack of critique? And if you do, why do you think it is?
Well, I think it's, you know, of course you're right. I think there are a variety of reasons. One is that as wine prices have accelerated out of reach of, you know, fine wine prices, let's say, whatever, expensive wine prices have accelerated out of reach of somebody on a, you know, respectable professional income. Wine writers are increasingly dependent upon access from the producers in order to write about the wines. So that's clearly a pressure. The sort of official answer I think a lot of people would give is that wine is is better than it's ever been. But in some senses, perhaps that's true. I think the more interesting question is wine more interesting than it's ever been? I don't know that that's the case.
I would argue.
What
I
else?
think I would argue as well. I hear that point as well. Wine is better than it's ever been, and that's why everybody at the Decanter Awards is gold. And Decanter might be an exception, but a lot of these awards now are giving out tons of medals, and the argument is everybody's better. But I think the reality is, in my experience, you then kind of recalibrate the scoring mechanism. And that scoring mechanism stays the same, just the caliber of wine changes. But what it seems like now is there is no real critique.
Well, I think also, let's be frank, the consumers and retailers and whatever have to bear a certain amount of the responsibility for this, because as a critic, I feel this very acutely. I could, back in the day, 85 from Parker for a Clap Cornas was enough to sell out the wine because it was a very good score. Now, 85 today would be a positive insult for Clap or for any of the top producers of France.
Yeah, I think so some critics wouldn't even give 85, right?
Yeah, I gave 55 to a Grand Cru Burgundy recently. It was Premog, because just to sort of make the point that we do still sometimes give very bad scores to very expensive wines from very grand producers, which I think is an important thing an important muscle to flex from time to time. But it is tricky, and what is the purpose of a score? The score is ultimately an attempt to sort of, in some sense, quantify the extent to which you're being recommended to buy something. I think consumers intuitively sort of balance the score against the price, and if it's a sort of $3,000 bottle and it's 91 points, then it's probably a sign not to buy it, in fact. Whereas if it's $15 and it's 91 points, well, that's a high recommendation. I think there's an element that people intuitively understand it a bit better than, sometimes you get very sort of retentive questions about what does it mean, and our scores sort of completely internally consistent and coherent across every wine ever made, and you get questions like this. But people, I think, are a bit more intelligent than that in how they understand them. But the fact remains that if it doesn't get at least 89, it doesn't really help anything sell these days. And that's a problem with the market and with consumers, too, that really constrains, if you're trying to send a message about a wine's quality and a wine that you think merits being purchased, what do you do? If you give it 85, then you're punishing it for being the most conservative scoring critic in the business, and I don't think that serves much purpose. But it's a very difficult situation, frankly, to be honest.
And William, when you're kind of tasting, when you're tasting in Burgundy and writing your notes and tasting in the cellars with producers, we've seen. I think people who follow your work will know that you, in a very professional way, you kind of critique a priori assumptions about, to what extent terroir is responsible for a certain thing and things like that, and you may challenge a wine. When you bring up if and when you bring up these topics with winemakers, do they think, I suppose what we see, this big excitement about terroir, do the winemakers appreciate a more nuanced
I think it really depends. It really depends, because remember, a lot of the winemakers I meet in Burgundy are sort of in hereditary business and not necessarily thinking that much about concepts. They may be thinking a lot about how to make their vine grow better and produce better fruit, but without thinking particularly about a concept like terroir. So a concept like terroir is part of the mental architecture of people, and those are the sort of things that we interrogate the least, typically, the a priori that we take for granted. For me, having a sort of historian's perspective, yes, absolutely, Burgundy was broken up into climat, and that sort of concept of the climat. Sometimes a heterogeneous geographical entity that combined complementarily, creates a superior wine, like with Clos Vougeot, incidentally. It's not necessarily just a small geological unit. But that sort of concept definitely came into being, but it's always existed in tension with the sort of capitalistic vision of the brand, which obviously triumphs in Champagne. But you see things like, you look at, I found an old bottle of Echezeaux Chambertin, it was called, So these things were brands. The Echezeaux Chambertin doesn't exist, and they're quite a long way away from each other. This is just a brand. Take two famous things people have heard of. Who knows what was inside? It's probably Marange with a bit of, a bit of Cassis and a bit of Marc de Bourgogne or whatever, So I think people can be a bit naive about not seeing that Chambertin is a place, but it's also a brand, and even today that's absolutely the case. And in France, I think we have this very nice notion that terroir, there's terroir everywhere, everybody can have it. Looking at the garden in San Antonio, Texas, it probably has it has a terroir. We could plant it with vines, but that if you're in France and you're talking about terroir, that's not really what the word means, because there's a hierarchy of terroirs, and your terroir is not Romanée Conti, at the end of the day. And so that's limiting, and that's constraining. And I think some producers in lesser regions, so-called lesser regions, obviously shy away from that. Because
this is a particularly pertinent point. I think people embrace this idea of terroir because sometimes it seems, very, very attractive, but intrinsic within that idea is a hierarchy that is constraining. And
and I absolutely believe that, it's more interesting to have a great diversity of wines reflecting their origins, yes. But when you talk about a Grand Cru, I mean, Louis Lichebella says sometimes that, Grand Cru is 90% wine, 10% imagination. You could debate the ratio, but there's imagination would mean history, ambience, a myth about these things. And there are a lot of places that are adapted to produce great grapes. And if you take great grapes, a great site for growing grapes, a terre à vin rather than a terroir, and if you apply fantastic viticulture with great Moselle selections, and if you can sell it for a price that allows you to do all of those things, then serious winemaking, you can produce brilliant wines in a lot of different places in France and elsewhere. That's clear. So the concept of terroir, if we interpret it broadly in this sort of way, the New World would like to say, so look, we look at the terroir of this sort of sand hill in Sonoma Coast. Well, that's fine, but that's not really the reality of accepting that concept. Yeah. If you accept that concept, you're always not going to be Chambertin.
Yeah, it's not really.
Unfortunately for you.
It's not really getting to the actual kind of, I suppose, the dialectic root of what terroir is, right?
Exactly. It's just a little superficial and a little naive to sort of, we can, it's employed as a buzzword. I mean, what if you have a Moselle selection with farming that keeps the vine from being overproductive with the right kind of trellising, pruning, you produce tiny berries. Next door, you produce fat berries from a clone and pump it full of nitrogen, lateral shoots going everywhere. Where's the terroir? I mean,
I don't think there's any better visualization than the video that you did on than Lalus Aligote. The two vineyards that are, right next to each other.
And I think, but it's difficult to have a nuanced conversation about it because, you either get classified as being a terroiriste or someone who's sort of attacking terroir. So I'm actually working on an essay at the moment. How do we move beyond, actually a rather limiting hierarchical system of the hierarchies of terroirs while still leaving space in our wine discourse for the importance of site, the essentiality of site even, which I think is critical. And how can we also, in fact, leave some space for the pleasure of the myth, of the emotion, of the imagination when you drink Chambertin? Because, hey, I mean, you open that. I think we should get as much pleasure as we can in many different ways as we can, but at least within the context of wine. And why deny ourselves the pleasures of the imagination as well as those of the palate?
And I'm working on something similar, looking at the kind of divide between East-West Barolo. It's stereotypically put down to the age of the soil, and there is something attractive about that idea. But let's go beyond that. And what does it have to do with tradition and the region and the people? But you said something to me the other day when we were talking about the 100-point system that I think ties into this very nicely. You said that one of the biggest benefits of the 100-point system is that it allows you as a critic to transcend the hierarchy of arguably terroir, but appellation. You can give somebody like this, Ulysse Collin from Congy, you can give them, a great score, and all of a sudden it doesn't matter that they're not from.
Right. I think that it's best. I mean, we all know what the 100-point system is at its worst, and that's what everybody harps on about ad nauseum. But at its best, it's actually a disruptive force in the wine world that can level some of these playing fields and can shake up classifications, which, while interesting and in some respects even helpful, have their limitations. And so that's something I feel very, very acutely in Burgundy, particularly because there is this sort of, is the Côte de Blanc for white and the Côte de Nuit for red, and then everything that isn't from those places is immensely disadvantaged in terms of how it's perceived.
It creates or even acts as a homogeneous measuring stick, right? It's essentially saying we're not particularly interested what's going on in place A or place B.
And I mean I still meet people who say, oh well, I like X producer because they sell a Bon Mar for a very good price. But if I want to buy a Bon Mar, I want to buy the best Bon Mar. One could say there are a couple of other very good ones as well. But I have no interest in buying a value Bon Mar. I mean, I'd rather buy the best Mercury or whatever. I mean, that's just not my approach to wine. So that gives me an opportunity at least to make that case and see if people relate to it.
I don't know whether it's the case anymore. I think Robert, who is online here, Wine Terroir, might be able to tell me. You used to only be able to get an hour with these Instagram lives, and we'll
find out in 6 minutes. Huh?
Yeah, we're 6 minutes away from that, but I'm not sure whether that's changed now. But something you just, we were talking about the 100-point system and the way that I agree with you. People argue against the 100-point system ad nauseum with, the same arguments.
We're familiar with those arguments, yeah. And some of them have some basis.
Apparently, we can do 4 hours. We're not going to do 4 hours of Instagram live. But
I have to open another bottle if we did.
I think we lost. Someone can tell me whether William's gone or I've gone.
Yep. Oh,
there we go.
Yeah.
There we go. I can see it. So something you were talking about then, William, was the ability of the 100-point system to transcend, terroir. And I don't think there's any better example of that than Grower Champagne. We're both drinking Grower Champagne now. I wanted to kind of ask you, I mean, first of all, I think perhaps if I start about why it excites me, and then kind of get to grips with why it excites you. For me, what interests me about Grower Champagne is not so much that, as a general rule, I think it is better, though, I suppose if I took what I consider the best examples of Grand Marque and the best examples of Grower, I do prefer the Growers, but as a general rule, I'm not saying it is better. But what I find is more variation, more idiosyncrasies, more signature. The story is a little bit more compelling. Do you like the ability of being able to go and taste those wines and score them against the Grand Marques?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a bit of an opportunity in the sense that I came to Champagne, and as I've already said, one of my priorities is to sort of foreground the agronomic basis of wine quality farming, and then also, I'm a great believer in what I would call artisanal winemaking, which is, classical, serious attention to detail, taking time, doing things by hand rather than industrializing and accelerating the process. And I found, I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think anyone gave 100 points to a Grower Champagne before. Things like that. So it was.
Somebody
started with Agliorier's 2008, but there have been others since, and all of them, to my mind, merited. I mean, I taste them, and I think sometimes people say, "Oh, you shouldn't give so many 100 points to Grower Champagne because it's only the Grand Marque." I taste them; they're very good. At least they seem very good to me. Now that people seem to agree to some extent, as the prices of the wines go up quite a lot.
Yeah, much to our grievance.
A little. That is the downside also of Standard & Poor. But so there was that, and you raise a very good point talking about more idiosyncrasy, and this is the same in Burgundy. Why is Burgundy so complex? Is it the diversity of terroir, or is it also the diversity of producers? And you could look at the grower movement in Burgundy in the 30s, and then second, third waves happened more recently, as in a sense sort of territorializing winemaking, creating the opportunity for us to see these nuances of sight. The nuances existed forever, but it's only thanks to grower bottling and small-scale production that permits that. Also because a small producer is to some extent insulated from the vagaries of the market. You can make your wines exactly how you want, and if you only have 30,000 bottles to sell, your chances are, if they're good and if there's some soul behind them, you'll find a niche for them in the marketplace. If you make 3 million bottles, you do not have that luxury. You have to make a product that's much more consistent and just it's less controversial ultimately.
As
So
as
yeah.
yeah, as well
I came to
as
Champagne. I mean, I also was sort of noticed this sort of perplexing phenomenon on wine cultures. A lot of people who will only drink small grower produced Burgundies always begin their meals with multi-million bottle production tête de
yeah.
cuvée big brand champagnes, and that was to me surprising. So just from a personal perspective, I was certainly very happy to. I try to be very just to the Grand Mark, and I think today the best mark, by going back to the vineyards, and in some cases for a long time,